All right. Well, welcome everybody. Glad that we're all here together today. And I wanted to start just by talking a little bit about the kind of dialogues that we've been having together so that all of us that are on this call right now can kind of drop into a similar territory, and also for our listeners to continue to be invited to go with us and to explore something new. What we're doing is we're not trying to just talk about new ideas or old ideas or perfected ideas or anything like that. It's not really about the content as the ultimate context, but it's about creating a way of being together, a way of togethering, a way of becoming with one another that invites a whole new set of possibilities. And we're calling this some sort of intersubjective dialogue, emergent dialogue. But it's a way for us to be more interested in unknowing and allowing something to arise between us, between all of us. And the idea here is that Chinese medicine, among many traditions, tends to build expert culture where there's a lot of emphasis on knowing things. And this is all great. But we know things, and then if we don't know things, we listen to our teachers and they know things, and then we see our patients and then we tell them things and they think we know things. And there's a lot of emphasis around knowns. And then the question is, while that has its gifts, what's the impact of that on being alive? What's the impact of that on intimacy with being human? What role can it play in separating us from each other when we're all busy knowing or needing to know? And so the invitation here is to, without negating the beauty of that, try something new. Something where we're allowing ourselves to not know as deeply as possible, throwing a topic into that well of unknowing, and then seeing what pops. What pops in the moment, which requires our direct experience. It requires that we be here and that we be here together. We can't abstract into what we already decided was so. So it demands a certain kind of intimacy and showing up. And so, of course, we're doing these dialogues and inviting all of you listeners to go along with us together. But it goes beyond just this and something to listen to, because then it can invite a possibility for how we are in the rest of our relationships, how we are in relationship to life, our patients, our community. And so with that said, I just want to invite all of us to take a moment to just connect into the place in between us. What is the space that is arising here already? What's the qualities and textures of this field that we're all as a profession creating? Those of us on this call right now and those of us that are listening. What's the quality of this being together? So I'll just invite all of us to lean into that. And then Heiner's going to go ahead and introduce our topic, and then we'll just all dive in together.
Yeah, thank you very much, Alexander, for reminding all of us again about the space we're trying to create together. And what has been a reason for us as a group, as a topic for today, is what is the role of pain and suffering in the healing journey. And it's been interesting for me to reflect on that in preparation here, because I myself was on a different path as becoming a teacher of Chinese literature, and it was through my own journey of pain and suffering that I found to the medicine. And of course, in the process was asking me, well, why is this happening to me? And find that all the patients asked that question too. And it's great that you mentioned, Alexander, that we are not trying to come from a place of finite knowing here, because in my own answers that I almost give daily to those kind of questions from patients and over 35 years of practice, I find that it's always different what what I answer myself. It's been the favorite topic of one of my main teachers of Taoism, to talk about shiku, not just like the healing journey, but also learning in general, and maybe the journey of life. He almost died 9 times during the Cultural Revolution and later. But he always gives these rousing and always different lectures depending on the state of his own heart on shiku, the eating bitter, which is the word for suffering in Chinese. And so it's I'm eager to see what emerges today with this topic, and what comes of it as we all kind of melding minds and hearts here together and see what floats to the surface. What is the role of pain and suffering in healing?
My own pain and suffering brings me to that place of unknowing, where there's a surrender that no amount of me being on top of things can reach. That being surrendered by the suffering, being surrendered into a greater possibility to open up to a healing that can't be touched by the knowing mind, but can be touched by the knowing heart. And if only we could honor the bitterness when it comes.
Yeah, I think the honoring of that bitterness for me involves the recognition that really the path, the spiritual path, is one of working with what is. And suffering often comes when I'm giving attention to the ego's almost childish demand, relatively childish demand, that things be some other way than they actually are. And that, this question of why me, why now? And the recognition that of ultimately obligation to others, the recognition, the context in which my experience is occurring is that as my identification with who I am and what I am has expanded to increase greater levels of wholeness and increasingly expands to include what I had originally thought of as other or others, recognizing them as myself and an obligation to that, then the context for my experience increasingly becomes a recognition that in the face of the suffering born of my own attachments, I know in my deepest heart and my deepest self that the main event, that the suffering is really a sideshow, and that the main event is my commitment to responding to what is in a way that engenders wholeness, and not primarily for the sake of my own relief, but for the sake of, in the terms of the Bodhisattva vow, being a boat, a bridge to bring others to the distant shore. And in that regard, I'm sure I mentioned this, I may have mentioned this in one of our previously recorded dialogues. I've been most inspired in my clinical practice by the patients who, in the face of unimaginable suffering, maintained a profound dignity. And one man in particular who was in his early 40s, had a family, and came to me the first day, and he said, I have a brain tumor and it's going to kill me, and I know that you can't change that. But the last gift I have to give the people I love is a death with dignity. And I want you to help me do that. And that touched me so profoundly and so deeply in terms of the care he had for others. And I have found in my own life that the more my care extends beyond my own feeling and my own fears and my own desires, to really embrace a care for a whole larger than myself, that in some sense my suffering grows deeper, but I have more and more context in which to be able to hold it.
I like that you mentioning the what is. It reminded me of an article I wrote a long time ago, All Disease Comes from the Heart, about looking at the role of the emotions in Chinese medicine. And I was very surprised when I looked at it, because we memorized the Qi Qing, right? The 7 emotions, the grief and the worry and everything else. And I was surprised to find as one of them the word I, which means love. It was like a mentioned as a pathological emotion. And of course, it's the correct translation would probably be predilection, or loving one thing over another, and then getting upset and suffer if you don't get that. What just similar to what you just said, it's like if your ego doesn't get what it wants. And that is like in some of the, I remember being in Eastern Tibet and having this, witnessing this practice of Tibetan monks overturning their bowls at night, which is a superstition in Tibetan culture, that you don't do that, because that's a portending death. And I've always found it to be a big clash between, especially very cynical German culture, where you constantly joke about the bad things that could possibly happen, and the more Chinese superstition of not ever hinting the only speaking like good things and never talking about anything bad, because it might actually happen. And so you've got these Tibetan practices where you literally go into, as we all know, onto the charnel grounds and blow the thigh bone of a dead person and invite the ghost to feed on your flesh. That's one thing, but also that what I saw myself, the overturning of the bowls, which is this kind of, no matter the overcoming of suffering, being with just simply what is, and finding that interesting, finding it meaningful, and finding it purposeful, and in the way that this is what the universe makes right now, and I'm going to be fully present with it rather than trying to turn away from that. And that's always been in both my engagement with the text, but also with people who've been teaching me those things, profoundly meaningful for myself, since I certainly know about greatly preferring certain things over others. It's just in the communicating that to patients who so urgently ask that question, that's definitely varies for me in how to communicate that in a way that it can resonate in the patient's heart, and that it creates an opening rather than a closing. But yeah, those were things that came to mind when Lonny was speaking there.
Mm.
I'd like to pick up on the thread of wholeness. You know, it seems to me that suffering is this kind of shaking awake to the presence of some kind of pain and some kind of resistance to that pain, sort of a turning away, or like an allergy or an addiction, kind of a grasping towards, or a pushing away. But it seems to me that it's inseparable from the well of virtue. And at least, you know, in my experience, that moment of suffering, which sort of awakens me to some division in me, when it leads to an embrace, a turning towards, bringing closer whatever it is that's holding division. What I've found is that then that opens something. It opens into a well of virtue. And by virtue, that could be action, but I'm speaking about it in terms of a breaking open of the heart into a broadening of experience. There's like something on the other side of hell, and it's, you know, it's glorious. And then then there's something that happens, because it's not just like Lonny said, it's not just about getting out of the pain. It's somehow there's a learning that happens around, well, I wanted to turn away, or I wanted to grasp, but yet I embraced the whole thing. And then something amazing happened. And now the whole thing is teaching me one little bit closer to, there's a whole to embrace, and every time you embrace more of it, there's more beauty to behold, more intimacy. And of course, whatever is happening inside of that process that's happening inside of me, it then immediately gets transferred into the collective. So that as my allergies get resolved, then my allergies towards my neighbors get resolved. And then there's less suffering on both sides of the space.
Invitation, an invitation into an opening of compassion towards self and others, and that moment of suffering is one that takes place in the context of time, where there's a seed, always a seed of where it comes from, and then how it emerges and blossoms into a presence, and then fades away. And so that suffering is tied to one of those, I suppose, phases of being and becoming and leaving. And so this becomes a process of time, and then it has to take place within some location. Is it in the zone of our relations with others, our relations with self, this kind of a bifurcation of being, a sense of being separate as the source of suffering, and then there's an intensity level that goes with this. And so I suppose in a way it's really no different than any medicine anywhere in the world as it occurs. But right now, I think we as a human species are suffering, and there's this profound level of zeitgeist trauma, if you will, taking place within the culture at large and within the people who are coming to see us. And so the need for that compassion to expand into the social systems in which we're engaged is ever present. And but this goes back to, more importantly, that suffering that comes from a loss of connection to source, and that when it somehow gains a fullness or a wholeness, as Lonny said, then something dissolves. Even the most excruciating pain of childbirth tears into the abyss of the unknown and the source, and this resolution seems to be an outcome of the most intense and terrifying suffering that a human can possibly engage. And all the while, it's a play. It's all passing.
I really appreciate where you took us there, Will. I mean, you took us in a few directions, but the one place that I'm very present in the conversation is almost like this this sense of the spectrum. You know, as you're saying, Will, there's intensities of suffering, but there's also, I mean, I think for me, I have to say that there are, because we are living in these systems of oppression or systems of annihilation, soul annihilation, they're systemic. And depending on our place in the system, the kinds of suffering that are inflicted upon us are different in a certain sense. And I feel like that's present for me, because I could say, yes, have I suffered? And I have, and I will, inevitably. You know, we're in bodies. For me, it's like just, you know, the contract, you get a body, you're gonna do this thing, You're going to confront this thing, this suffering thing. But then there's also the place, there's a sort of external positioning. So I've been sitting with that as I'm listening. But then for me, it comes back to the suffering, the role of suffering in the healing process, or when I'm in with a person, whether that person is myself or a patient or whoever I'm with, the turning point seems for me to be around the illumination of the experience with meaningfulness, or a kind of, like, I think of, like, I'll often be like, can we take this suffering out of its embeddedness in this materialistic, whatever, why me, or victimization, and can we illuminate it with purpose and meaning? Because that seems to be the turning point, in certainly in a clinical experience, and because I call my work, and I've been using this term alchemical for so many years, it's the crux of the alchemical process, is that moment when we're transforming what seems opaque and leaden and impossible and limiting and constraining into something that blossoms into growth. And so I guess where I'm coming to and listening to you, Will, was like, so is the suffering amenable? Does it allow for that infusion of purpose and meaning and agency? And, at what level of suffering does that become impossible, in certain experiences? That's present for me. And is there an arrogance to assume that it's always possible? That's a question. As a basically white-skinned middle-class person in this world, is that assumption, can I make that assumption that there's always a way to make it meaningful? There's always a way to amplify it with myth or dream or symbol or meditation. So that's been percolating. But then the other piece, and I think, Will, you alluded to that and you brought it forward so beautifully, is that there's also a kind of planetary zeitgeist that we are all, like, we're one body suffering on the planet right now. And that suffering is that our home, like our place, our body, this earth is undergoing this incredible suffering. So, in this moment, I walk down to the shore on a daily basis, this shore that I know near my home, that I've known for 35 years. And over those years, I've watched that very shoreline, just this little coastal place, go from being, full of life and sea life and snail shells and seaweeds and crystalline waters here on the coast of Maine, literally in my remembrance, to going down and seeing broken shells and there's a dead muck in the water. And, so what I can't comprehend, the suffering of the planet, I comprehend in my own body on a daily basis. And I go, how do I make this meaningful? But I will say that one of the ways is to be together in this way. And just hold it.
This holding it together and feeling it together and feeling the different qualities of invitation into the suffering, into the gates of suffering together. That is so poignant, and it gives it its own meaning that nothing else can when we're trying to avoid suffering. And the gates of suffering, I loved how the qualities of division and the qualities of separation and the qualities of resisting our own suffering keep us out of those gates where there is a death of the old, that as the divisions, as the separations dissolve and a new possibility arises, that something new is birthed with a totally different quality that is simply because of the suffering that it is there. And without that suffering, that new quality cannot emerge. And even in the process of dying, of being with somebody who's moving into the loss of the body and the another emergence, that same quality is palpable. That it's because of the decay and the pain and the suffering that you feel this emergence, that there's something being birthed, that all we can do is bow in awe and reverence and say, I don't have any idea about this suffering, but it's my teacher. It is my God at times, because I don't know what else to do but face it and to go through those gates, because it's way too painful to hold myself back any longer. That's not a possibility.
Lorie, I think you bring up a great question. You know, does suffering always have a purposefulness? And certainly it seems like suffering can lead to decay. It doesn't have to become meaningful. But what occurs to me as I was listening to you and then what you were saying, Randine, is that while it can lead to decay, and while it might not feel purposeful, it can lead to purpose. And I think that that's why the last part of our question is, what is the role of suffering in the healing journey? Because I think that's something that maybe we're all in our own ways holding. By all, I mean all of us as human beings that are listening and engaging with this dialogue. How do we catalyze the fruits of suffering? How do we recognize the systemic nature of suffering? I know certainly for me, you know, in contemplating the over 2 decades since my father was murdered, it's like, you know, looking at the perspective of the killers and looking at the perspective of my father and looking at the perspective of how it's impacted my life and the lives of those around me, it's impossible to get somehow separate from that we're all suffering together, and that there's always a potentiality for that to become something beautiful. And it doesn't always. But I think that's what we have the opportunity to explore as practitioners of any modality that seeks to help. How do we lean into that and say we're all hurting in some way, we're all suffering in some way, and how do we draw out the blooms?
I'm really going to go off on a tangent, a little separate from what you just said, but pain and suffering, pain is a signal, and suffering allows us to pause. It allows us to pause, and in that pause, which is like a pregnant pause, many things can arise. I'm thinking more about awareness, on how to navigate the flow because of the pain that is and suffering one is experiencing. It opens up a whole area of other possibilities one might not have contemplated. As Randine said earlier, the heart knows. The heart knows something. And when we surrender to our limitations that our ego wants us to perform, there's a certain taking over of possibilities that comes from the heart. The heart's intent can manifest itself in mysterious ways. And pain and suffering opens up compassion in us. And when we are with our patients, for instance, there is no other. And because there's no other, there's no, I'd say if I was in pain and I'm treating somebody, I'm oblivious to what my pain is because I can't perceive myself anymore. So I'm freed from it through this compassion I've had for somebody else's pain. Like I said, I don't know if I'm going off on a tangent.
Not at all.
I wanted to earlier make a remark about your distant shore, but it's gone from me. I welcome pain and suffering that I've had in my life because it has really made me rethink and stop and pause, and opened up many doors for me in my own life. And this whole thing of why me, that victim mentality, it gives you an opportunity to convert that into being the hero of your own journey. When you hear yourself claiming victimhood, alchemically, I'd want to transform that into how can I be the hero of my journey under any circumstances? And there are so many possibilities. I feel open to one. So it's an invitation for transformation, basically, at levels we may not have perceived before the suffering or the pain. I have some sort of optimism for the earth. I know that there's a lot of pessimism going on about what's happening these days. But I feel like it takes a few little candles to create a big light. And hopefully we see it in our lifetime.
Vansanthi, that's really beautiful. And it's funny when I was writing something, taking a note here, and as I was writing, you said it.
Mhm.
And then you said, I hope that's not too tangential, but it was so to the point, I thought, that so many of our patients suffering in my experience, and in my own life, my own suffering, has been often so deeply rooted in the notion of my sort of misappropriation of attention, or my wrong framing of thinking that because I've had certain experiences and there must be a problem. And that because I've suffered and because I've had painful experiences, there must be a problem. And that actually healing means getting back to how I was before I had those experiences. And what life has taught me is that being whole really, for me, means learning to live with a broken heart. And that broken heart really is the source of a deep compassion that extends first to the self for being able to hold all of who I am as I am, with things being perfect exactly as they are and not needing to change, because then there's no victimization, because there's nothing left to have to resolve before I'm whole. And as I've opened up to this deep compassion in myself, realizing that seeing that really, from a bodhisattvic point of view, which is always a reference point to me, it's sort of our commitment to eat bitter and be the alchemists that transform it into all of the virtues. Doing that hard work for the sake of being exemplars, and also to engender the virtues in ourselves, to bring wisdom and compassion and integrity to others. And it's through that journey in myself that brought me to a place where I can sit with every patient, hold all their pain as it is, and in spite of how terrible the suffering may be, never lose sight of the light, never lose sight of the virtue, never lose sight of the Buddha nature, and just keep speaking from it and to that within them relentlessly for as long as they come, never giving up hope. And Lorie raised the question about, well, privilege, and is it always possible to make a choice and to derive meaning from our suffering in the ways we're talking about? And I think we can acknowledge on the one hand that we're talking about a relatively elevated perspective on life, but we have exemplars through the ages in every economic class who've done this. And I remember reading a story, and it might have been 20, 25, or even 30 years ago now, on the news, was the story of a man in New York fell onto the train tracks off the subway platform onto the tracks in the face of an oncoming train. And a guy just jumped in, got on top of him, and held his head down as the train went over them. And they were both okay. And the guy who did it, I heard interviewed, and I mean, I don't know, he was just an average guy, as far as you could tell. I mean, there's no great philosophical context. His philosophical context was, I was surprised as anyone. I did it. I didn't think. And I think that choices are made at a soul level, even precognition in us, for the truth, for the good, for the beautiful, depending on, sometimes it's conscious and we can have a really elevated philosophical discussion about it. But I think the true, the good, the beautiful is inherent in the life force and can, for reasons of soul development, come through anybody at any stage, in any demographic. I mean, we know that people in concentration camps, people in the face of the most horrific genocides have spontaneously made choices to save everybody else. And so I think it's that impulse of that soul's recognition of non-separation and of obligation that gives us the strength to overcome whatever forces of doubt and cynicism within ourselves or within culture are there. And I think that really increasingly, it's my own experience and I have been fortunate to have led a relatively blessed life. I think that clinical experience teaches most of us, as crazy as we thought our parents were, and as much as we thought we went through, after about a year of doing intakes on patients, we realized I ain't seen nothing, and from that comes a kind of humility and a kind of just inspiration from the strength of these people who come through, who are coming to us to heal them and are teaching us so much as our teachers.
That's a great summary, Lon. Vansanthi, what you were saying about the victim, the why me stance. I see that. I see that I am the source of my suffering. That if somehow I'm not fulfilling my obligations, my purpose for being, that purpose, however it gets built, or doesn't get built, as in the case of many who appear in our clinics, is a very powerful focal point of suffering. That person who's engaged in livelihood which is not in alignment with their values or the values of their communities, bears a weight. So sometimes that weight is one of shame. There's any number of colors that and shapes that this experience that we all learn from so deeply, yet at the same time often seek to avoid. That in that moment of coming to terms with that suffering, the possibility of its transformation emerges. And that's that alchemical set of possibilities of emerging from the dark night of the soul and the nigredo, and through to the albedo, into some kind of presencing in consciousness that is connected to purpose, is connected to source, connected to the people whose lives we share. And then there are ways we have in our medicine of connecting with this, right? And we use the linger, right, as a way of connecting with heaven in a sense, and the hashu is a way of connecting into our bloodlines and that suffering that we carry through generations of suffering within our own. And yet it's still a thing, an object, a doing, which brings consciousness to the poignant sensibility of that suffering.
I'm loving the pieces, how they're like, like you said, Randine, this is in a sense a mystery that not one of us alone could even begin. But like in listening to each of you, I feel like these little, almost like pieces of stained glass are forming a kind of a something that feels illuminating. And I loved what you said, Vansanthi, and then Lonny, you always remind me of, I'm thinking of seventh chakra, I'm thinking of Qatar and the Sephirot in the Kabbalah. It's like that we can go to that place and we can hold that place even with, in the clinical encounter that feels, and we've all been in them, that feel like where, how do I hold this? But it is from that other place. But then, so if there is this coming into this, almost like going to Shen, or the overview that allows us to see the wholeness in that way, but also then, Will, you speaking, when you spoke, I'm starting to think, oh, right, the medicinals and the mushrooms and the fungi that actually love the decomposition, and love the entropic breakdowns and muck and dissolution, and teach us to root down into it, to transform it. So both this, kind of taking this larger illuminating view from above, but then also going down into the roots and, trusting the fungal wisdom that really will allow for that transformation. And even Vansanthi, as you said, that we can trust that there's a biology at work that is healing even on a planetary level. And to remember that, I appreciated your reminder of, a potential for optimism too. So.
It all seems to feed like this idea of a kind of a collective upright chi. That if we can like really use the suffering as a catalyst for this possibility, not only personally and for collective humanity, but Earth itself, seems also to be kind of shedding an old paradigm. And I think much of suffering is because we come against things within ourselves, within society, that just, this is not right. And there's a certain amount of suffering in saying, no, I won't do this. No, I can't do this. No, I can't. And rising above that and like vibrating at a different level where that lower possibility of suffering just no longer is. And I love that idea of, there's hope in the center of the suffering for a new emergence. And then I can move into the suffering a little more and to see that, no matter what, the Tao does not err. And that statement I have never been able to go against. Like, the Tao does not make mistakes. The Tao doesn't err. And if I can remember that and have trust, even in the midst of the greatest suffering that I think is just going to annihilate everything, it's like, so it's annihilated and something else arises. And being able to, we've all had the experiences of walking our patients into places that we didn't know what could emerge in the way of healing, because we walked them to their edges, through their edges, where they didn't think they could go because of the suffering that was there. And I think that's always been the highest purpose of healing, is to walk somebody into, through, and beyond their suffering.
You're muted, Lonny.
Yeah, Randine, when you said that, what was coming up for me at the same time is that so much of what we do at a depth involves helping a person learn what the real nature of their suffering is, and to face it, because there's so much displacement. And there, we did a whole talk on resistance, and a big mechanism of resistance is just the displacing of attention and energy and resources onto issues which a person is convinced is the nature of their suffering that needs to be attended to. And it's really just a way of avoiding it. An easy example is people who think that their big issue is needing to, stop smoking, stop drinking, or stop doing this, that, or the other thing. And the real issue is facing into whatever the thing they need to give up is helping them to avoid facing into. And so I have just always found that a very big part of my job involves helping that a big part of suffering, one of the biggest parts, if not perhaps even the biggest, is just misplaced attention and incomplete framing and understanding, and helping bring people into just a bigger perspective and investing less energy into the compensations. And, you know, I gave example of compensations like smoking or drinking, but they can also be things that get positive societal reinforcement, like exercise. You know, I mean, anyone would say, well, exercise is definitely a better thing to do than smoking cigarettes, but they can both equally be used to avoid facing into what is the real nature of a person's suffering. And a person comes in and they think, I'm suffering because my knee is injured and I have a 5K coming up and I don't think I'm going to be able to do it. But that's really not the nature of it. And again, as with everything, I think in my own experience, it was my own path in becoming clear on what the real nature of my suffering was, in terms, and you know, Will said it beautifully, that it usually comes down to me. It usually, right? It usually comes down to me. And then Lorie framed it beautifully as, yes, and there is a nature of culturally induced suffering, which doesn't just come down to me, but then we have the inside and the internal and the external, which are both need to come together as one and are both important.
And yet, what you said so beautifully, Lonny, and it's so helpful for me to, when you realize there's the external conditions that do create states of suffering, or it can. There's the internal ways that we resist coming back, because really we got to this through resistance, our conversation last time. But the reminder that the outside and the inside aren't truly separate, and that we can affect our experience of these outer, our inner position, or our inner attitudes, or our inner alchemy can transform our experience of those outer conditions. And that, of course, if we want to say what's, you know, for me, what am I doing in the treatment room? I think one of the key things I'm doing is supporting the person I'm working with in discovering that inner work that will transform their experience of the outer conditions, and that they're not, in fact, on the level that we're talking about, just like we're one body here, you know, the inner and the outer aren't truly separate. It's a really big one. That's like a really big one, but I'm definitely sitting with it.
Well, and sometimes we have to take to the streets. I mean, Martin Luther King's mountaintop speech was medicine. And he wasn't really talking specifically about just us all making an internal adjustment to a sick society, but really changing. Oh, am I muted?
No, you're great.
No,
Oh,
we can hear
good. Okay, good.
you.
Will said something earlier that triggered something. And as Lorie said, the qualities and the degrees of the suffering is different. And Lonny also mentioned that our patients, they have probably much more intense degrees of suffering, different kind of flavor. But on some level, the deepest sense of suffering is this losing the connection to the source, because the the Tao itself is, since Chinese medicine is essentially synergistic, so spring is wood, is sunrise, is liver, is sour, is all of those things. And so if we take the rising and the falling of the Tao as these different phases that we call the 5 phase elements, then we have the different flavors, just like the Neijing says, generating each other. And coming back to this chiku, eating bitter, we could really say that all of the flavors have a flavor of suffering, with the in vernacular language, like life is sweet is about the only one that is free of suffering. If you say life is sour, life is salty, life is pungent, life is rotten, or go into the smells there, or certainly life is bitter. Those are all kind of movements of the Tao to try and return to the center, but it's almost never at the center. But in all of these flavors, there is a transformational process that wants to return to the source. And as I experienced with my own process of becoming a healer, it's this: if without the suffering of having the disease and the fear of the cancer and facing death or so, I wouldn't have been shocked into this realization or deeper reflection of, why am I here? What is this all about? Are you just here wasting time? So there is that all of the, as long as the realization is there that this is connecting us to the source, or even theoretically, mentally, as long as that is there, one could say one is not really suffering. But when there is nothing but darkness, and there isn't just the question, when will this end? When will this turn sweet? When is it ever going to happen? But there is no source. There is no source. Like, that is a deep darkness that I didn't fully understand at the time. But Lonny mentioned the concentration camps, right? There is the growing up in post-war Germany in the 1960s and 70s, we were required, while I had of course, cushy, relatively cushy upbringing there, and I didn't understand why all the adults were so serious, but we were reading these lots and lots of reports and about concentration camp survivors, and philosophical reflections about that. And there was always incredible light emanating from people who survived to tell the tale and had the soundness of mind to share an incredible open-heartedness and spirituality, really, that was inspiring. But it was the bystanders very often that, after the fact or from the other side, are reflecting from a philosophical perspective and concluding that after the Third Reich and anything that is like it, like genocides in Myanmar or wherever it is later, that there can't be a God, there can't be a source, that the concept of a source and a purpose is absurd, that's the moment where that energy of real bitterness or real suffering can come in, because even for just the reader or so. Yeah, but I think the nature of the Tao itself is, in essence, is without suffering, there is no movement, there is no Tao, there is no return to the source. It is that which returns us to the source. Certainly, being born the year of the ox, it's always been like that for me, that it's the reminder to think about what am I doing? What are you doing here? Are you wasting time or not? So yes, thank you all for I agree with Lorie. There is these stained glass. I like that metaphor. It's great to have these conversations.
One of the things I hear in what you're speaking, Heiner, is loss of heart, and the difference between having pain and the capacity to turn towards it, and having pain in such a way that it leads to a kind of suffering where there's a loss of heart. There's a deep wedge that's placed in between our experience and any source of goodness and any remembrance of returning. And it seems to me that some of our patients come with having had already learned how to be with suffering in some way. And then there are those who arrive who are in a place where they've lost heart. And there's that, perhaps this is what I feel as you're speaking, Heiner. I mean, that may be, the worst kind, if we're gonna if we can say something like that. But the kind of suffering where there's nothing, we don't notice or know of anything that's connecting us, or there's no orientation to a light. And I think that with suffering being a collective endeavor, and compassion being a learning how to embrace the pain of another as if it was our own, in a transformative fire of the heart, it seems to me that one of our most important tasks as practitioners is to do whatever it takes to learn how to recover any places within us where we've lost heart, and what kind of support is required to do that, so that then we can pay that forward, so to speak, and be able to be, what I've felt from you, Lonny, for years, where we can be this unrelenting commitment towards deeper potential and possibility, not because we read it in some book and it sounded like a great idea, but because we're living it every day when no one's looking. And we're finding all the ways and all the places where we don't know how, where we've lost heart. And then we do something about that with love. We bring love to that, and then the whole gets bigger, and then we become something that's unbroken, that can always stand for the unbroken in others.
Or it can carry the spirit of brokenness well.
It was, I think it was Viktor Frankl who came up out of the concentration camps, Germany. And of course, we've seen this take place in Russia. We've seen it take place in China. This historical recurrence of genocides and atrocities. But Viktor Frankl brought forward a very profound light from his experience, just as a mirroring of what you're saying there, Heiner. And but I want to return to where we started to go with Lorie, with the notion of the mushrooms, and that ginseng is one of the plants that is said to nourish source chi. And I was taught by one of my teachers to use it in meditation formulas, which were also combined with cinnamon and peony to connect between self and other and harmonize those rough edges of isolation. Suffering as isolation from others, suffering as isolation from source and self. And while it's again an object which is used as a tool, it still brings a memory. The plants teach us those connections. They've been here so much longer than we, and they will sustain those connections longer than we. And it's a teaching that is an extraordinary blessing. That awakening to the possibility of that sweetness of life in the cinnamon, and balancing it with the sourness in the peony, and appreciating those moments of suffering, actually appreciating and loving the moment of the suffering as the pathway to some form of awakening and presencing into source, into connection with others in a way that's healing and recovering of our original states.
I love that you brought up ginseng in the Tanya Jing, the decoction classic. I love that map of the 25 herbs. It's classified as earth within earth, right? Center within center, sweet within sweet. So it's why everybody wants to have the ginseng, because I remember when I first started getting herbs from Korean herbalist in North Chicago, while I was recovering from my cancer, I was always waiting, when is she going to give me this ginseng? Because for me, it was the end, marked the end of the suffering, and I would return to the sweet. But then later, as a researcher of GU syndrome and chronic inflammatory syndrome and chronic parasitism, it's the number one plant that you're not supposed to use, because it'll inflame all of them, make everything worse. And so in a certain way, I find like ginseng is the most, at least in my clinic, the plant I use the least, even though patients want it the most. And it's maybe a metaphor if everybody wants to get out of the suffering faster and kind of not deal with these, right? The parasites are manifestations of these subconscious desires or egoic kind of presences or so, and unless we somehow go through the cycle there and bring them into the light of consciousness, there is no shortcut really for that. So thank you for that.
Yeah, and it reminds me of the Wu Mei Wan, right? Coming up out of from the Joy Yin, from the darkest depth of night, breaking forward into the light and removing those. I really like that connection between parasites and the ghostly apparitions.
I feel like they wanted to be here. Because before Will and Heiner, you brought this up, it kept coming to me that one of the blockages of the transformation are the possession states. And of course, then I start going to the 7 Po and their different, sticky adherences. And then you two started talking about the GU syndrome. And I almost feel like they wanted to come in that level. They want us to recognize, for me, where I am with this now is the transformation comes through the deep caring for the terrible suffering of the lower souls and their addictive, graspingness. But as we're almost at time, I feel like, maybe we're actually beginning our next conversation. So I'm going to just let it go there. But when you started speaking about that, Heiner, I was like, oh yeah, that's just where I was sitting. Like, what do we do? How do we How do we heal that level? Yeah.
Since we actually brought Chinese medicine into it, I wanted to just give a shout out to the small intestine in terms of transforming bitterness, right? Removing the obfuscations of the heart by transforming bitterness, and in grasping, you know, the heart's connection to union and non-separation in as sort of the miraculous result of having eaten the bitter, approached with deeply sincere practice and intention to be free, the miraculous result of having transformed bitterness into a lack of cynicism, which means to me, you know, a wide open embrace of the infinite possibility, no longer living in an inherently limited context, and the sort of spiritual self-confidence and soul depth that comes from having made it to the distant shore time and time again, so that when suffering comes, we begin to relate to it as an opportunity, with no doubt that on the other side of it is a greater liberation, not just for ourselves, but for everything and everyone. So there's a joy, that's the heart's deep joy, to know that even when the suffering comes, that that here we are again, and the meaning is created in our approach to the suffering in that way, that we don't even have to create meaning. It's just every moment is filled with it.
And I think by mentioning the small intestine, we have come full circle with your original remark, Lonny, that said the acceptance of what is. For me, the small intestine has always been the what is meridian, because right in the Baihu Tong, you've been originally the first and almost only writer mentioning that the 5 phase elements are the 5 virtues, right? And the fire virtue is Li, which is not just a deep appropriateness and politeness, but that word originally means sacrifice, sacrificing our attachment to, I dislike this, what the universe is bringing me, I'm accepting it as what is, and letting go of what I want, but see what the universe is bringing in. And so the kind of, for me, the small intestine has been, well, that virtue is stored in the heart, the administrator, and making sure, coming back here to Alexander's words of that this is happening in everyday life at every moment. That is the job of the small intestine in a certain way. So yeah.
Beautiful.
And what would the world be like if we, in the presence of something terrible, we learned from direct experience to be able to say, oh yeah, man, I can't wait to see what's on the other side of this. What would that be like? And what would it be like if, as practitioners, even just every practitioner who's listening to this, every person that's listening to this, just explored that kind of embrace a little bit more? That when there was the presence of hell, there was an exploration of what place do I need to be in inside of myself to be able to get my heart wide enough to get around that pain, to just see if on the other side of that, something miraculous didn't happen. I imagine that we live in a very different world. It seems like I listen to it as an incredible invitation for what being a practitioner can be.
Well, I think we might have done it.
Mhm.
Beautiful contributions from everyone.
I'm suffering because we have to say goodbye.
This is just such a delightful space. I could just eat it all the time. I suffer when I'm not.
Let's not say goodbye. Let's just say fare thee well.
Yeah.
Fairly well. Thanks for putting this together, Lon, and thanks for everyone.
Well, I think we're all doing it now, Will.
Yeah.
Beautiful contributions from everyone, and just to thank our audience, and we'll do a few more of these, and then maybe we'll look at opening this up to having guest speakers and other possibilities. We'll look into where else this can start to go. Very beautiful. Okay, so